You know those moments, a flash of genius, a narrow escape, something that just feels like it's more than a coincidence. Well, what if there was a way to actually identify a hidden force at play in those moments? Today, we're diving into a really fascinating framework that claims to do exactly that. We're going to break down 5 specific signs of what it calls the hand of God.
So what are we even talking about here? What would these signs actually look like in the real world? How would you tell the difference between just random luck and something more? That's the big question we're going to unpack.
And the ideas we're breaking down today come from a sermon that gives a really detailed 5-part answer to that question. So we're going to walk through each of the 5 signs it describes as manifestations of the hand of God.
Okay, so here's the game plan. The 5 signs are supernatural creativity, then supernatural speed, supernatural wonders, something called judgment on enemies, and finally, a really powerful one called terror and dominion. Let's jump into the first one.
All right, first up, supernatural creativity. Now, according to this framework, we're not just talking about being good at art or music. This is about generating those game-changing business ideas, solving problems that seem totally impossible. Basically creating something amazing out of nothing.
So the idea here is that you're tapping into a totally different level of thinking. It's described as getting beyond normal human strategy and kind of tuning into a divine frequency, a place where you get ideas and solutions that you just couldn't have come up with through logic alone.
And to make this crystal clear, the sermon brings up a really famous example, the story of feeding 5,000 people. I mean, from a normal point of view, the disciples just saw a massive problem they couldn't solve. But the argument is that a whole different kind of math was going on.
So they started with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Simple math, right? That adds up to 7.
But here's where the interpretation takes a turn. In this view, the number 7 isn't just a number. It's a symbol for spiritual perfection. The idea is that the raw materials for this miracle were already, in a way, perfect. And then, after everyone was totally full, they collected 12 baskets of leftovers.
And again, this number gets its own symbolic meaning. 12 is seen as representing the establishment of divine government. So from this perspective, the miracle wasn't just about food. It was a demonstration of moving from a state of perfection to setting up a whole new system.
Okay, on to sign number 2. This one is all about acceleration. It's called supernatural speed. And it's this idea that you can get things done in a time frame that just completely blows away normal expectations.
Now, what's really interesting here is the contrast. You've got the normal path, right? You follow the rules, you learn from other people's experiences, and maybe it takes you 20 years to get where you want to go. But this path of supernatural speed just throws that whole timeline out the window. It suggests you shouldn't tie your own destiny to how long it took someone else.
This quote from the source really says it all. It's just a flat-out refusal to be boxed in by what everyone else says is possible.
But, and this is a big but, this kind of speed doesn't just happen magically. The sermon argues it takes some serious discipline. There are 2 keys. First, you got to shed unnecessary weight. That means ignoring all the drama, the gossip, the negativity. And second, you have to stay laser-focused. I mean, speed is pretty useless if you're going in the wrong direction, right?
All right, sign number 3. This is where we get into things that are, well, a little harder to explain. It's called supernatural wonders. And it's about when your life is filled with events that you just can't rationalize with normal natural laws. Now, this is a pretty bold idea. The premise here is that if every single thing about your life can be logically explained away, that's actually seen as a sign of failure. The argument is that a life that's truly influenced by a higher power should have some parts that make people scratch their heads and say, how did they do that?
To make this more concrete, the sermon points to examples like the early disciples straight up asking for signs and wonders, or the story of Samson doing these impossible feats of strength, like literally ripping a city gate out of the ground and carrying it up a mountain.
Moving on to our 4th sign. This one totally changes the way you're supposed to think about opposition. It's called judgment on enemies, and it's all about shifting who's actually responsible for the fight.
Basically, the idea is this: you no longer have to fight your own battles. When you come up against opposition, the problem gets handed over to a higher power. Your enemies become God's problem, not yours.
And this quote just nails it. It's about being able to genuinely rest, to sleep at night, because you trust that your defense is being handled for you. The whole point is to take that burden of anxiety and that need to get even right off your shoulders.
And that brings us to the final sign, and it's probably the most intense one.
It's called terror and dominion, and it takes that idea of divine defense a step further. We're talking about preemptive influence.
And just to be clear, this isn't about you trying to be scary or intimidate people. The argument is that a divine presence in your life projects its own authority that neutralizes threats before they can even get going. The sermon uses Gideon as an example, a guy who personally felt weak and small, but his enemies were already having nightmares about him before he even showed up.
Okay, so let's do a quick recap. We've walked through this 5-part framework for what the source calls the hand of God. It starts inside you with creativity and speed. Then it moves to external wonders, and it finishes by totally reframing opposition through judgment and this idea of terror and dominion. When you put it all together, it's a worldview where human potential is just radically expanded.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. No matter what you believe personally, looking at a framework like this raises a pretty interesting question. How does seeing your challenges and your opportunities through a lens of supernatural potential, how does that change how a person might approach their life? It definitely puts a whole different spin on everything from a business plan to a personal conflict.